been able to observe that over many years. The Reverend Dr. Renee Waun, known to many of us by her license plate, the Reverend Mom, Rev Mom, or to many more of us as Renee. We have been the recipients of her insight and wisdom over many years, and we are happy to have her share with us today more of those insights on her faith journey, from her faith journey, before she journeys on to Western Pennsylvania. She has a remarkable educational background. I just want to hit some highlights. She had an undergraduate concentration in music and French from University of Eastern Michigan. And then she earned a Master of Arts degree in linguistics from the University of Pittsburgh, a Master of Divinity, and a Doctorate of Ministry, both from the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. So that is a remarkable background that probably helped to focus her attention in a number of areas. She worked as a public school teacher. She worked as a Montessori trained teacher for 10 years. And in 1981, she was ordained as a United Methodist minister and began to serve on the staff at the First United Methodist Church in Pittsburgh. Renee and I met shortly after that at that location when we were both younger, had school-age children, and had no gray hair. By her own admission, in 1988, she was a full-blown heretic, pushing the limits, became a lightning rod advocate for persons living with HIV, and challenged the church's teaching in those areas. She published an award-winning book in 1999 called More Than Welcome, Learning to Embrace Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Persons in the Church. Then she talks about breaking away. That same year, she announced her resignation from the United Methodist Church, later took a staff position at the First Unitarian Church, spent 3 years there in that congregation, and gradually took on the ministry of East Suburban, Ligonier Valley, don't want to miss anybody here, and Morgantown. And Ohio, yes. Oh, sorry, Ohio Valley. She's traveled extensively. She spent a year in Switzerland, which has also informed her faith journey. And so I am pleased today to welcome Renee to share with her insights from that remarkable faith journey.
I guess somebody thought it would be a good idea for me to share a little bit, and I'm honored to do this today. And I hope it dovetails a bit with the theme of the day, which is moving from power and privilege to the beloved community. And I hope that my life in ministry has been an example of that. So I'm retiring in 6 months, and by then I will have spent 37 years in ministry. And before that, 16 years as a teacher, and at the same time, military chaplain for 10 years and working with a school in Africa for 15 years. So it's time to retire. I'm not going to go into the gory details of how it happened that I started along this path. Suffice it to say that the call to ministry came out of the blue with no expectation. I never could have predicted that I would be doing something like this because I was perfectly happy being a successful teacher. But as I opened myself to this unexpected idea, it just seemed to click, and somehow by now it seems to turn out to be a really good idea. So after going through the many years of seminary and other preparations for ministry, I was ordained by the United Methodist Church and appointed to the big church in Shadyside. And when I arrived there with my head full of all these new ideas that I had gotten in seminary, I admit I did not have a very sophisticated view of ministry. Basically, I just looked out the window to see who was there and then opened the doors and let them in. Now, Shadyside, as you may know, is a very gay-friendly neighborhood. And so some of the folks who were coming through the doors and sharing their stories with me were people who had been wounded by the shabby treatment from their previous churches because they were gay. And as I listened to what they were saying over and over again, I would get this uh-oh feeling inside that kind of welled up because the denomination that I was serving at that time stood against these folks. The rules clearly stated that homosexual behavior was incompatible with Christian teaching. So as time went on, I felt more and more at odds with this teaching because it didn't match at all with the stories that I was hearing from these personal experiences of the people. Something just wasn't right, something didn't jive. So I began reading everything I could get my hands on about this topic, and eventually my uh-oh became aha. I saw that the church teachings were wrong because the life experiences of these oppressed people took precedence over any church doctrine that would actually keep them oppressed. So in moving from uh-oh to aha, I became an accidental advocate for a whole population of LGBTQ people who needed someone to plow this new ground and stand with them. I didn't know what to do with all the stories that I'd been listening to in my pastoral office, so I wrote some of them down in the book that I had published. And I won an award for it, but of course not everybody in the church was celebrating. Not only did they have to put up with my habit of changing the words of sacred texts to make them inclusive of women, and not only did they have to put up with my unorthodox theology. For example, one Christmas Eve, when I started to give the message, I said, tonight we have Matthew's interpretation of the illegitimate birth of Jesus. Let's see how he handles it. But now they had to put up with a minister who openly welcomed gay people into the church and even organized special activities for them. Well, with all the outlandish things that I did over there, no wonder I got labeled a heretic by some people, but hey, I could think of a lot of other heretics, and I figured I was in pretty good company. So to make matters worse, I joined a group called Soul Force. Soul Force was an organization that used the principles of Gandhi and King to challenge the religious right on their oppression of gay people by showing up by the hundreds at national church conventions. Like Southern Baptist, Assembly of God, and so on. We got trained in nonviolent protest by people like Anand Gandhi, who is Gandhi's grandson, and Andrew Young, who is a pastor who had worked with Martin Luther King and became a congressman from Georgia, an ambassador to the United Nations, and the mayor of Atlanta. I got trained by people like that. During my years with Soul Force, I got arrested 3 times, and I spent time in jail in Orlando after demonstrating at the Southern Baptist Convention. I was also arrested one time in Washington, D.C., but I had the privilege of being arrested with Reverend William Sloane Coffin. Of course, he was a civil rights activist, author, pastor of the Riverside Church in New York City. As a member of Soul Force, I got to meet hundreds of such people as we tried to open church doors across the country and educate people about oppression. And I was certainly inspired by people who were willing to dance on the rim of risk and do whatever they could in spite of getting in all kinds of trouble with their denominations. Once I had opened my heart and my mind to those issues, it seems like I was questioning everything. And then, in 1998, I made a trip to Nepal and India, where all of my previous beliefs were called into question. I had mind-blowing encounters while trekking with Buddhists in the Himalaya mountains, watching bodies being burned on funeral pyres at the banks of the Ganges River, seeing the living goddess in Kathmandu, observing live animal sacrifices in the mountains near Dakshin Kali, and meeting the Dalai Lama in person at his home in Dharamshala, India. I came home from that trip on the afternoon of Ash Wednesday. That was the very day that I was scheduled to participate in a community-wide worship service with other clergy. And I was sitting there waiting for my part in the service, and I saw everything before me through a whole new set of lenses. These little pieces of bread and tiny little cups of juice for communion, and the vessels of oil and the anointing of ashes on people's foreheads, I was thinking to myself, what does all this mean? I don't think I can do this anymore. I don't think I can do this anymore. So that was the beginning of the end for me theologically. Nothing made sense anymore. And plus, I was getting more and more into hot water because of my very visible public persona. And just about that time, it became known that I had a book coming out soon, and that it would be a critique of the church. And some of the people, the ones whose stories would be in the book, were very happy about that, and others were thinking it was probably time that I left the church. It was Renee's issue, after all. It's just Renee's issue. Well, when I heard that, I knew then that it was indeed time for me to leave the church. It wasn't where I belonged. I felt like they should be paying somebody else to do the job who really liked doing that and doing it the way they wanted it to be done. I wasn't the right person for the job anymore. And besides, I thought as soon as I leave, they'll see that it's not Renee's issue after all, it's the church's issue, and that would be the best possible outcome. So I gave my notice a few months in advance, and soon after that, I was sitting with some other ministers at a city-wide breakfast sponsored by the East End Cooperative Ministry. And I happened to be sitting next to David Herndon, whom I had known over the years as a respected colleague, just down the road a piece from my church, a guy whom I'd had some great conversations and shared some activities in the past. And David said, "So, Renee, what's going on with you?" And I said, "Well, I'm leaving the ministry." And he said, "What?" So I explained everything, and then he said, "Well, you should come over to First Unitarian sometime and preach a sermon. Now, there's a place where people would really appreciate you." So then in January of 1999, David called me to preach, and it was on Valentine's Day, and I accepted. The service went very well, and I really loved it there. And then I think it was around April, David called my office and said, "Renee, what do you think you're going to be doing once you leave First United Methodist Church?" And I said, "Well, actually, I was planning to stick my head in the oven for a few months and live off my savings." The truth of the matter was I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do next. So David said, "Well, we have this thing over here called Summer Minister. He thought we might get you interested in that." And then he went on to describe the position. And then he said something really brilliant, because my first reaction was to say, "No, I don't think so." But David said, "Don't give me your answer right away. I'll fax over some information, you look it over, and then I'll get back to you in a couple of days." Well, he faxed over the description and the other details, and it looked like something I could easily do. So I thought, wow, I guess this is an indication that I'm being cared for. So I said yes. And then when I went over to First Unitarian to get oriented, David gave me the tour. When we got to the Undercroft, there were 2 big trash barrels by the kitchen door filled with empty champagne bottles. And I remember saying something like, "I think I'm going to like it here." You would never see that in the United Methodist Church. But with that, I served as summer minister, and then in the fall, the job morphed into director of adult RE, and then after that, social justice minister. I ended up being on the staff there for 3 years, and during that time, I also became part-time minister at East Suburban Church. And then after they found a building, my main focus was to help them through the process of the purchase and to reorganize priorities and go from being nomads to fishers and farmers. And so my job at First Church was ending anyway. And within the next few years, my scope of ministry then expanded to include Ohio Valley, Ligonier Valley, and Morgantown. And I say, 4 congregations in 3 states, which puts a lot of miles on my car. So I have to say it was quite an adjustment at first, moving from one denomination to another. I had to keep a low profile because the United Methodists still held my credentials. And after I started working at First Unitarian, the bishop's office called me in and they said, you know, just because you're working in a denomination that does Holy Union ceremonies, you know you're still not allowed to do that, right? And I said, I understand. I didn't bother to mention that I already had done dozens of Holy Union ceremonies. And then I would continue to do so. I would just have to stay under the radar and not get caught. By the time I had left the United Methodist Church, I had served almost 20 years in ministry. And I had worked my way up to traveling around the country, chairing some pretty important committees for the region and for some national organizations. For example, I chaired the district committee on ordained ministry. I chaired the national workshop on Christian unity. When I came over to First Unitarian, I had to learn a whole new set of acronyms. I had to learn a lot of new names, a lot of new procedures, and I was very self-conscious at first. It was tough realizing that after all this time in ministry, I was actually starting all over again. No one knew me. My UU colleagues looked at me suspiciously because I had not been fellowshipped like everyone else. Was my ordination as valid as theirs? Did I have aspirations to bigger things? Would I try to compete for the big jobs? Well, no, actually I was perfectly happy doing what I was doing, having cobbled together these different congregations. I did receive membership in the UU Ministers Association, so I'm a card-carrying member, which is good. And over the past 18 years, I've outlasted most of the other ministers in this district, well, with the exception of people like David, who's been here forever. And speaking of Herndon, I want to publicly acknowledge that if it weren't for him, I really don't know what I'd be doing right now. Honestly, I don't. I probably would have been burnt to a crisp in the oven by now. David, I will never forget your kindness, your generosity, and the collegiality and trust that you placed in me for this work. And honestly, I want to just thank you from the bottom of my heart. Now finally, here's a little side note about what happened at First United Methodist Church after I left. The work I started there continued. And about 10 years ago, they voted to become a reconciling congregation, which is the same as welcoming congregation. And they are one of the foremost advocates for LGBTQ rights in this whole region, organizing pride events, leading the way for greater openness and inclusion in not only the United Methodist Church, but in the greater church, which pleases me very much. It was their issue after all. I hope that what you all get from this story is a sense of how important it is to listen to your inner truth and to align yourself with it. Our strength comes not from mandates from above or around us, but from inside of our own selves. I have come to appreciate this more than anything else about UUs, that we are a people of values and that we are willing to stand up for these values. If we listen to our inner truth and live our values, we can face into any challenges that might come along. And it's good to remember to stay open to the unexpected, because that's how we grow and evolve in our faith. I want to thank you all for being part of my amazing journey. I will always carry fond memories of each of you and these extraordinary years of my life in ministry as I retire. So thank you.
Refugees, we would like to offer you this small token of our appreciation for your spiritual guidance and leadership.
Oh, thank you so
And
much.
I telegraphed what you were wearing, so your picture. Oh, look at that.
And I love that term, Renee's refugees. Okay, so I've I've been asked to do a benediction, so I would ask that you rise as you are willing and able to receive the benediction. Let us go forth from this place for another year of mission and ministry, always listening to that inner voice of truth, that voice which is our highest, wisest, most open, loving, and generous self. That voice which leads us steadily and sometimes unexpectedly into places and situations we never could have imagined, but all for the sake of and in the name of love. May our intentions point us more and more in the direction of justice and equality. May we search our hearts for any traces of hatred or racism, privilege, supremacy, bigotry, and fear, and cast them out. In fact, let us care for and protect the victims of these negative forces wherever we may find them. May our actions be in alignment with our values and with our principles, and may we show the world the very best of what it means to be a people of faith, not only for this day, but for all the days that lie ahead. And until we meet again, namaste, blessed be, and amen. Thank you all for coming.
We've got an additional little surprise for you. Whenever you're ready.
The Steel City Ukuleles knows Renee as our bass player. We also know that she ministers a lot in the area, and we were invited out to play a few songs because she likes ukulele, and we like her. And so we picked. We don't want to overwhelm you with music. We picked 4 quick songs. We're gonna play through. If it gets to be too much, you can boo us or whatever. But we don't. We're gonna play anyway. And some of the songs, I'll kind of yell at. Some of the songs are kind of sing along. So if you can sing along with some, you will know them, I'm sure. So with that, we're just going to jump in. The first song we have is called Magic Penny, which is a favorite of this particular church. We've played it here on several occasions before. And so it's just a nice song. And the chorus, you can pick up on the chorus real good. So with that, I guess we'll start. 1, 2,